Hey everybody, Don here again. Welcome to Volume 1 of Bucktails. Some of you guys asked for to hear the stories on some of the bucks I've taken over the years. And, I said when I was showing the video on how I mount the antlers to a plaque that I name all of my bucks. So this is Volume 1. And we're going to start with a buck that's really kind of special. He's not a huge deer by any stretch of the imagination, but here he is right here. This was taken in 2008, and it's called the Tanglefoot Stomper. This was taken in Grafton, New Hampshire, not too far away from here. Really a pretty little 8-point buck, but by many hunters' standards, not a trophy. By my standards, absolutely a trophy. And the story is pretty cool. Go back to 2008. I was looking at some of the pictures from that time period, and I am amazed that I was even able to get up into the woods the way I was. I think in 2008, I was probably at my heaviest point, somewhere around 300 pounds, maybe a little bit more than 300 pounds. And when I look at the pictures that I'll have at the end of this video, it just really saddens me that I'd let myself go to that extent. Right now I'm sitting at about 245, and I'd like to drop 25 pounds. But to think that I was at 300 at that time just blows my mind. So let me get to the story. My hunting partner, Franny's 85 years old now. So at that time, he was probably 72. I guess that was 13 years ago. So he was 72 and still running the mountains like a wild man. Him and I were going to hunt together, but his daughter needed his truck. So we decided to go in my Jeep. And when Franny and I hunt together, we hunt a specific area, but we'll come in from different directions. We're actually not hunting together, but we're there if one or the other of us needs the other to help drag out a deer or whatever. So on this particular day, we were hunting in an area that we called Tanglefoot. It's a piece of property my friend Billy W. owned, and he had taken 50 acres and he'd cut every stick of timber off of it. We named it Tanglefoot because as the stuff was starting to grow back, whether it was blackberries or whatever, the low-laying slash on the ground, I mean, it was really easy to get tripped up. So we named it Tanglefoot. Subsequently, on the north side of that property, another friend of mine, Jimmy, owned an 80-acre tract of land, and he was a logger, and he had done some selective logging. And that was a place we had had great success in prior. So the plan was for me to drop Franny off on Jimmy's land, and he was going to work his way around the top of this pretty good hill that had a big oak flat at the top. I was going to run up through Tanglefoot and hug the edge of Jimmy's land, and we were going to just kind of work our way around slowly until we met up about 4 hours later. So as it turned out, I dropped Franny off, and then I drove up in as far as I could, and I got out and I started skirting the edge. Well, the piece that Jimmy had logged was gorgeous. I mean, it was loaded with oak and hemlock, and there was a ravine that ran between the two pieces of property. And there were skitter trails that came right up, about every 60 or 70 yards, a skitter trail had come up, and he had selectively cut that. So I was sitting on a stump. Now, back in these days, Franny and I both were, even during the rifle season, we wore 100% camo. I don't condone that, but that's how we rolled. And now at the very least, I wear an orange hat. But back then, we were in total camo. Because we know each other so well, and we know that neither of us is going to take a stupid shot at something we're not exactly sure what it is. So anyhow, I had worked my way up and about 400 yards up on the hill, and I found a stump that was on a skitter trail looking down into the ravine between where I was and where Franny was eventually going to work his way around. And I had my gun on my lap. I had my little 308, and I had my gun on my lap, and I'm just sitting there watching down below me, probably huffing and puffing because I had walked in about 400 yards probably. And I heard that sound that many of us who are hunters are familiar with, and it was a single stomp. And I stopped and I was like, okay, that's a deer. And those of you who hunt know that, often when a deer sees something, he doesn't know what it is. He will stomp his front foot, he or her, whatever, it'll stomp its front foot, trying to make that object move and use that as a defense mechanism. And so as I sat there with my back to this noise, I heard this distinct stomp. And then again, stomp. And I was like, okay, after the second one, now I know for sure there's a deer behind me. So I have my gun on my lap. And like I said, I'm in full camo, and I am turning my head as slowly as humanly possible. And I got my thumb on the safety, and I got my hands wrapped around the gun, and I'm just slowly turning my head, trying to get a glimpse of this deer that's stomping at me. And all the while I'm doing that, stomp, stomp, stomp. And I mean, I was smiling from ear to ear, because I thought something good was going to happen. And when I got just about here and out of the corner of my eye, I could see it was a deer. I could see it was a buck, and he had a rack, and turned out to be a little 8-point rack. I knew I was going to take this deer. And as soon as I got to where I could see him, he'd had enough. He'd probably stomped 10 or 12 times at least. And he had enough, and he blew, and he turned, and he ran straight away. And I spun on the stump and went, bah! And that deer stopped perfectly and looked, and just in time for me to bring up the gun and send one into his heart. And he bolted, and he went boom, 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 3 bounds out of sight, and I could see the blood pumping out of the side. I had hit him on his right side, and as he turned away, I could see him bleeding out the left side. So I knew I had to pass through, and I knew it was a heart shot because the blood was spraying out. So I was pretty excited. Now, Franny and I mean, we're old school. We don't have radios. I don't even think Franny had a cell phone back at this time, but we had a signal. And if one of us heard the other shooting, then we would wait, 30 seconds after we were sure we had done, what we thought we had done, and we'd fire off 2 quick shots in succession. And that would give the other person a point to head towards. So I got up immediately because I knew this deer was down, and he had gone right down into this ravine and got all the way to the bottom, probably only made 5 or 6 bounds, but he was dead on his feet and running downhill, and there he was piled up at the bottom. So I got to work cleaning him out, and pretty soon I hear our other signal, which is, ho! When we get close to where we think we're going to be, we don't whistle because we're both half deaf. We give out a big ho. And so we were ho-hoing back and forth to each other until he showed up. And of course, we're high-fiving and all that good stuff. And now we got to figure out, we got to get this deer back up and across Tanglefoot. So I told Franny, I gave him the keys to my Jeep, and I said, listen, why don't you go take the Jeep, go get your sled, which we use these plastic sleds for dragging out deer. They work awesome. And while you're doing that, I'll drag this deer up the hill as long as it takes me to get him up the 60 or 70 yards of hill to go, straight up. And by the time you get back, I should have him at the top, and we can drag him out with the sled. It'd be a whole lot easier. So off he goes. I went about the task of dragging that deer up that hill, and it took me a long time because I would take my pack and my gun, I'd take it up 20 yards, and then I'd just drag this thing up. I wrapped a rope around its antlers, cut off a short stick, and just used that to drag him up. But it was steep and it was hard going. Well, and as out of shape as I am, as you'll see by these photos, I got to the next logging trail over. I was almost at the very top. and there was another stump, and I sat down on this stump, and I was catching my breath. I was huffing and puffing. My gun is leaning up against a tree over here, which wouldn't have mattered anyhow because I'd filled my tag. But as I'm watching, this monstrous 10-pointer comes walking through the valley and through the ravine with his nose to the ground. And it was a big buck. It was a 200-pound buck and a beautiful big 8-point rack. I just watched that and just laughed. And a little while later, Franny and I met up and loaded the deer on the sled. And I said, listen, you got to come back here tomorrow. I just saw a monster buck. You got to come back here tomorrow and hunt this area. And we got the buck out, dragged it in. I think the deer ended up weighing 142 pounds. Like I said, he's not a big deer, but he's a beautiful buck and really good eating. So the next day, Franny did go back to that area. He had a tree stand probably a quarter of a mile away from where I had seen that deer on the other side of the area we called Tanglefoot. And he came back there the next morning and he shot this buck. You'll see a bunch of pictures, but the biggest buck of his life at that point in time. The deer dressed out 196 pounds. He had a beautiful 10-point rack, and he scored 150 and 2/8 or something like that, Boone and Crockett. Just an awesome trip. The funny part was I spent the next day butchering my deer, and I had him in the garage, and I had left my cell phone in my in the house, and Franny was trying to call me to tell me he'd shot this big buck, and I never got the call until he showed up with this buck in his truck. But that's the story behind the Tanglefoot Stomper. And this is a really special one. Not so much for the deer itself, but for the day hunting with my partner Franny. So episode 1 in the books. We'll see you when I get to telling story number 2. Thanks for coming along. Peace.